Hi, I'm Billy Idol, and this is my rockumentary.
Rock and roll! Mama! Wow! Guess whose Halloween costume is tax deductible this year?
Hey, little sister, what have you done?
Billy Idol was an icon for the 80s if there ever was one. He just had the look, the spiky blonde hair, the leather outfits, the lip. The man was made for the video era, and in fact he was one of MTV's first homegrown superstars, one who wouldn't exist without music videos. But he also put together a musical style all his own, a mix of punk, glam metal, and new wave that added up to a steady supply of smash hits through the 80s. Just as his stage name predicted, he made himself a rock idol. Then we came to the 90s. Actually, Billy had a really huge hit in 1990, Cradle of Love. But 1990 isn't really the 90s. The 90s wouldn't start until September of 91 when, Yes, it's time for yet another edition of Nirvana Killed My Career. Billy Idol's not the first guy you think of when you talk about victims of grunge, but he was definitely one of them. Despite his punk rock look, Billy Idol's vibe was of sex and drugs and good times, stuff that seemed tired and done by that point. So, after the alternative revolution took hold, Billy had two options. He could keep doing what he was doing, or he could adapt himself to the new ethos of rock music. He did neither.
Welcome to the Interzone.
Nice spikes, Billy. Why does he look like Gary Busey wearing a Bart Simpson wig all of a sudden? What the fuck is that? I did not realize I was gonna need to buy a Borg outfit to complete this Halloween costume. Whatever, I'm leaving it on anyway. So yeah, in 1993, Billy Idol released a baffling and bizarre concept album, an epic sci-fi tribute to new computer technology and virtual realities, but combined with the classic rebellion of rock and roll.
We made it through joining together with computers, man and machine.
It was called Cyberpunk, and it bombed. Entertainment Weekly called it cybergunk. Rolling Stone said it turned Billy Idol into self-parody. Billy could have filled that CD with dial-up noises played for the same length of time, and it would have sold more records than this. His career had a total system failure, and he would forever be deleted from the world of popular music. What on earth was this? Well, it wasn't successful, whatever it was. So let's check out the album that put the flop in floppy disk. This is Trainwreckords. God, that's an ugly-ass album cover. That alone is a bad omen. Well, anyway, what is cyberpunk? Well, the short answer, it was a genre of science fiction started in the early 80s and prominent through the 80s and 90s. The major themes are virtual realities, cyborg body modifications, and underground urban subcultures that exist in conflict with a ruling class that mostly consists of super powerful corporations. The movie Blade Runner was the progenitor of that movement, but it came to prominence mostly through literature, the novels of William Gibson especially. From there it quickly moved on to other art forms like comics, video games, role-playing games pretty prominently, anime, which was just starting to reach the West, and multiple Keanu Reeves movies. Whoa. But punk as an art form is first and foremost a genre of music. So musically, what is cyberpunk? How does cyberpunk relate to punk rock? Well, it doesn't. There is no cyberpunk rock. That's not a thing. So really, what Billy Idol was trying to do here was incredibly ambitious. He was basically trying to start his own genre. But then again, Billy Idol was always kind of alone in his own genre, even in the 80s. He has some similarity to some of the other hard rock acts, but not really. There were no Billy Idol rip-offs or wannabes. It was always just him. So maybe he could pull this off. And for what it's worth, he seems really sincere about this project. It's a way to bring him back to his punk roots after years as a superstar. See, he'd been in a horrible motorcycle accident, he had to have all sorts of mechanical shit implanted into his leg, and he realized, man, I'm basically a cyborg now. I'm a cyberpunk. That may be why he looks like Max Headroom all of a sudden. Maybe it was intentional. And he loved the idea of bringing computers into his music. He could do everything he wanted from home. Quite exciting, this computer magic. I mean, that's pretty punk, right? Punk is kids banging in their garage, DIY and all that. Well, now he could do the same. He didn't have to have some engineer fiddle with billions of knobs. He could do it all on his own through the magic of Pro Tools 2.0. See? That's totally punk. He doesn't have to conform to your rules. He's bringing down the system. The big single, Shock to the System, is the most Billy Idol-ish song on the album. If you're a fan of Billy Idol's big hits, then this is the song for you. It's also the only song from this album on his Vivo page and on his greatest hits albums. I think it's the one thing from this era he's still most proud of. Honestly, I think it's pretty decent. Maybe it's a little too close to being Rebel Yell 2.0, but it's definitely the most pop-ready single on the album. It's certainly strong enough to have been a big hit, so why wasn't it? Well, I have a theory. See, it's about rioting. Rioting on the streets of Los Angeles. In case you don't know, this was inspired by some real-life events.
We are getting word this evening of some rock throwing by youths in south central Los Angeles, perhaps in reaction to today's verdicts in the Rodney King beating.
Yeah, Billy Idol was living in LA during this. He watched it happen.
I actually had a whole different set of lyrics that were nothing to do with riots or anything like that, and just seeing what was happening in front of my eyes, I just rewrote the lyrics immediately.
In fact, on the album, right before this song, there's a little interlude of what I think is actual news clips about the actual riots.
Rioting downtown. If we saw just a little while.
Okay, I want to preface this first. I'm not saying that sci-fi or fantasy should never dive into real-life issues, because every now and then you see think pieces like, should, I don't know, Westworld be taking on slavery in a sci-fi setting, divorced from race or history? And I say yes, obviously it should, because otherwise that's a show about nothing, and it would be very boring. We should be able to dramatize real-world topics without having to be excruciatingly literal. But I get where those think pieces come from, because sometimes those allegories get a little on the nose, and it hits a weird, ugly note. And in this case, yeah, maybe Billy's dancing with himself a little too close to reality. Like, the LA riots were only a year old. It was still a really raw wound. A lot of people didn't want to hear it, and even if they did, I'm not sure this song really does the actual event justice. The LA riots were about a very specific thing, and that thing wasn't robots or techno corporations. And Billy Idol wasn't the ringleader of the riots, or involved in them, or even known to the participants. The rioters weren't blasting Billy Idol. And most importantly, there's just no anger to it. Shock to the System makes the LA riots sound fun. Oh, what a night! That's the first big problem with the album. Sci-fi robs Billy Idol of his intensity because Billy Idol was already always a cartoon punk. But at least he used to be a cartoon in the real world. Now he's a cartoon in the cartoon world. And maybe he thought tying himself to the very real LA riots would give him some grounding, but it just exposes how toothless he is. You know, he's a rebel with his rebel yell, fighting the system! Which in this case is a machine, both literally and metaphorically, and Billy Idol as the protagonist album is violently rebelling against it. You could say he's trying to rage against this machine. Except by this point we already had a band for that. They were called Rage Against the Machine. You might have heard of them. And despite the lurid sci-fi imagery of the name, they were intensely serious about very real issues. If they wrote a song about the LA riots, it wouldn't be about big bad Billy Idolborg fighting cybercops. We'll get back to the punk part of this album, but let's zoom out and look at the cyber. Shock to the System is the closest to Billy's classic sound, but the rest of it is actually much different, with a heavy emphasis on technology. The It even came with a whole bunch of bonus features on floppy disks. Oh man, check out those Sega Genesis graphics. I want to play like NBA Jam or Mortal Kombat now. We got lyrics, liner notes. I mean, you could probably have just gotten most of this in the CD booklet. But these are on a computer, so they're much harder to navigate and read. I feel I should mention at this point that cyberpunk is not just science fiction. There were actual cyberpunks. I'm not clear what they were exactly. I think it's just another name for the hackers and hacktivists of that era, but they were a real subculture. Even the album intro was adapted from a popular cyberpunk manifesto.
The future has imploded into the present. Megacorporations are the new governments. Cyberpunks are the true rebels. Cyberculture is coming in under the radar. Welcome to the Cyber Corporation. Cyberpunks.
If you can hear that and not see Keanu Reeves talking to cybernetic dolphins in your head, you're a better man than I.
Into the Wasteland.
And that pretty much tells you all there is to know. I can't quite tell you the actual plot of the album. I don't think it has one. It's just a mix of vague cyberpunkian themes. Like this is the opening track, Wasteland. Wasteland is pretty much the template for the entire album. The sound of 80s rock mixed with 90s dance and techno. Unfortunately, at some point, Billy Idol traded his spikes for some really grody dreads, pretty similar to what Vanilla Ice was wearing around the same time. I did not get a wig for that. Like, not even on Halloween. No. But the techno stuff, sonically, that's the big new element to Billy Idol's new image. A lot of dance beats, a lot of samples. Is it wrong to say that I'm enjoying this a lot? Shock to the System comes right after it, and just based on these first two songs, I'd rate this album fairly positively. But listeners and critics at the time did not agree. Why? Well, I mean, look at it. He's wearing a goddamn codpiece! This isn't just dated to our modern eyes, it was dated at the time. Was anyone at the time doing big, flashy rock and roll like this? Okay, yeah, actually there was.
It's alright.
Yeah, U2 of all goddamn bands. They changed their entire image even more radically than Billy did with their 1991 album, Achtung Baby. And that album had a mix of rock and dance that was pretty similar to what Billy's doing. But it was a huge success. And I think that's because of some major differences. First off, that album's really good. Secondly, they released it more or less concurrently with Nevermind, so they got in before the rock scene really started to change. Thirdly, and this is important, U2 got in early on the defining hallmark of the 90s, postmodern irony. Everyone understood that Bono was doing an over-the-top, self-conscious parody of Rockstar. But Billy means this entirely sincerely. This shit is very cool to him. And in the age of irony, it's almost laughably pretentious. Like, he was hanging out with Timothy Leary, the LSD guy from the 60s, and at the time, Leary was talking about expanding your mind, not with drugs, but with virtual reality. That's what the single Adam in Chains is about.
Do you want to be hypnotized? Fix your eyes on a spot. Doesn't matter where. Just fix your eyes on one spot and begin to relax.
Yeah, this goes on for quite a bit. I mean, it's relaxing at least. Is this an ASMR video?
Wind down and relax.
You've stolen my heart.
Again, I really like all of Billy Idol's 80s hits. And I'm in a conundrum because I don't think this is really all that bad as music. I kinda like it.
Why make up a lie?
But at the same time, I cannot pretend that this is not impossibly lame. With Billy Idol and his dreads, swimming with virtual mermaids, or just the way up its ass title.
Like Adam in chains. I want you there.
like Adam in chains. He wants revenge on God, I guess, because virtual reality has unchained him from God's demands and given him the fruit of knowledge, or I don't fucking know. Billy Idol came to music videos when people were experimenting with whatever weird shit you could put on TV, but that was then. And now it was a time for people to stop being goofy
and start getting real.
Real world.
The 90s! Okay, I'm not saying there was no room for, the theatrical, otherworldly aesthetics in early 90s rock, because there was, kind of. You had White Zombies, Hot Rod, comic book thing, and also 9 Inch Nails with their gothic industrial look. In fact, if there was an actual cyberpunk music, it was probably heavy industrial rock. But industrial and 9 Inch Nails and Rob Zombie, even at their biggest, they were metal famous, not pop famous. They were too off-putting and harsh and underground. Billy Idol didn't want to be underground. He wanted to be a superstar. He wanted to be a rock god like Elvis or Mick Jagger, walking around on stage in his leather pants. I mean, it's right there in his name. He wanted to be an idol. All of his success was built around his image of coolness. Billy Idol, without his cool, is nothing. And this shit is just not cool. I'm a madman! I shook up the world! By 93, Cyberpunk wasn't Blade Runner anymore. It was Lawnmower Man. Look, if you've ever sat through Johnny Mnemonic or Virtuosity or the Stallone version of Judge Dredd, the cyberpunk aesthetic will never be cool to you again. But long before those movies, there was already a big backlash against cyberpunk everything. It was almost done by 93. And even if cyberpunk hadn't been played out by that point, he's writing sci-fi anthems about books! Like he wrote a song called Neuromancer, about the book. I'm the Neuromancer, and I'm trancing. Oh, geez, it's so cool. It's just like a Neuromancer when Case gets his cybernetic implants that'll dissolve unless he helps the AI escape the cyber corporations. Like, imagine if instead Billy had written an album called Steampunk, and he walked around in goggles and Victorian trousers. It would have had exactly the same effect. Even the actual cyberpunks didn't like him. Everyone could tell what Billy was trying to do by hooking himself to the hot new subculture. He looked like a poser, because he was. He hadn't even read Neuromancer! The actual writer called him out on it! He just wasn't ever a real punk, cyber or otherwise. Johnny Rotten called him the Perry Como of punk. Like, his stuff flew in the glam era, but he looked like a phony compared to grunge, which was full of punk attitude. Especially Kurt Cobain, an unhappy drug addict with really snobby taste in music. But the album has one major thing in common with Kurt Cobain. For both of them, it all went wrong with heroin.
Well, I wish I was born 1,000 years ago.
This is Billy Idol's song, Heroin. It is the centerpiece of the album. It all builds to this. And if you don't recognize, this is actually a cover. The original is by the Velvet Underground, whose songs about life in the gutter were a major inspiration for punk rock. This song especially.
When I put a spike into my vein.
It's really gritty subject matter for a time when all the major bands were writing about peace and love. And its sound is just very raw and very uncompromising. And Billy Idol did this to it.
That I just don't know, and I guess that I just don't know, 'cause it makes me feel like I'm a man when I put a spike into my vein.
Now, I've never used heroin. I don't do drugs. And that's not me advocating for a drug-free life. I'm a miserable asshole and maybe I should. But I at least have an impression of what using heroin is like from people who have used it, and it's not this. You sure you didn't mean to title this Ecstasy or Special K?
Jesus died, somebody's sins but not mine.
Oh, that line is that's from Gloria by Patti Smith. So this is also a mashup.
Jesus died. Somebody sings with my mind.
And we're at a rave. A heroin rave.
Sings with my mind.
Turning a Velvet Underground song into this is like taking Blade Runner and letting Michael Bay remake it. But Billy loved it. The entire album revolves around this song. And it goes on for 7 minutes. You know how Billy turned into a robotic monstrosity because of some virus that kept adding more and more extraneous random mechanical shit onto him? That's a metaphor for this song. It came with like 6 or 7 remixes. That's at the halfway point, and you can just ignore the rest of the album. It's really boring from there. That was a big problem in the early 90s. All the albums were too long. I told my little brother to check this album out for fun, and he shot me back one short question. Who is this for? And I don't have an answer for that. Like, I could have seen something like this being big in the 80s, or maybe just 5 years later in the late 90s, because The Prodigy was bringing punk energy to techno, Marilyn Manson was being all theatrical. But again, that's edgier than Billy Idol was willing to go. He wasn't going to wear any fake boobs or put any piercings in his pretty face. If U2 could go electronica in the 90s and Billy Idol could not, I think it speaks to a different depth of feeling in their fan base. Like, if Lady Gaga has an album that doesn't have a bunch of hits on it, then it's underrated, or a fan favorite, or at worst, a minor entry in her catalog, because her fans are that devoted. But if Katy Perry's album doesn't have a bunch of hits, it's a giant failure and her career might be over. That's where Billy Idol was. In the end, Billy Idol really was caught in a dystopian future. A dystopian future called the 90s that didn't have any use for relics like him. But I can't help but have affection for this album all the same. It's a cheesy, gaudy, insta-dated disaster, but it just speaks to the dork in me. There's just absolutely nothing like it. And it was ahead of its time. Like, what is SoundCloud rap but a bunch of kids with computers making their own version of punk rock without the help of major labels? And don't techno corporations, in fact, control everything now? Like, maybe Billy Idol wasn't the best person to bring it to people's stereos, but cyberpunk is absolutely the music we need in 2018. Welcome to the Cyber Corporation. Cyberpunks.
Chain out of the world still burns.